3 years ago, I would have laughed if you told me I'd be making this video. God? I thought that was for weak people who couldn't handle reality, until reality itself brought me to my knees. Back then, faith seemed distant, foreign. I trusted only in what I could see, touch, and understand: science, logic, reason. I had no patience for what couldn't be proven. Faith? A crutch for those too afraid to face life's harsh truths. I was certain I was right. My family, my friends, they tried to nudge me, to tell me there was more to life than the material world, but I ignored them. To me, people who believed in God were just avoiding the cold, indifferent truth that life is brief and nothing more. But what happens when the ground beneath your feet begins to shift? As we continue this inspiring story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. And let us know in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. At first, it was subtle. Life moved on, but doubts began creeping in, questions without answers. I had no room for them, yet they lingered. One evening, after another exhausting day, I sat alone, staring at the wall. No distractions, just me and the questions. What if we're missing something? What if there's more to this life? Then one day, everything changed. I lost my job, and suddenly I had nothing but time to reflect. The world I had built on logic began to crumble. The questions weren't just ideas anymore. They were now part of my reality. Sitting there, alone with my thoughts, I realized I wasn't okay. The emptiness I'd filled with skepticism felt unbearable. It was as if I was standing before a door I wasn't ready to open. I wasn't always the person I am today, the person you're hearing now. My roots, my upbringing, were all steeped in religion. My parents were devout, the kind of people who spent Sundays at church, Wednesday nights in Bible study, and any other free moment praying, reading, or speaking of God. We lived and breathed faith, but for me, it never felt real. It felt forced. Looking back, I can understand the intention behind their devotion. They wanted me to follow in their footsteps, to walk the same path, to know the same peace they believed had saved them. But I couldn't see it. I couldn't understand it. It wasn't that I hated God, or even that I rejected the idea of faith. I just couldn't find a way to connect with any of it. To me, the teachings felt hollow, like a collection of rules meant to bind me to something that didn't make sense. By the time I was in my teens, I was done with it. Every day, I was pulled between the world my parents expected me to live in and the world I saw outside my window. The more I tried to conform, the more I felt like an outsider. So I made a choice. I'd rebel. I'd fight against everything I'd been taught, everything they'd tried to impose on me. I stopped going to church. I stopped reading the Bible. I stopped pretending. It was almost like a silent protest. The arguments between me and my parents escalated. I was accused of turning my back on God, of rejecting everything they had raised me to be. But I felt liberated, free from the shackles of what I perceived as an illusion. I no longer had to force myself to kneel or mumble through prayers I didn't believe in. And that freedom, it felt exhilarating. In college, I found my calling. Philosophy, debate, logic, all of it felt like the puzzle pieces I had been searching for. I thrived in that environment, surrounded by others who questioned everything, just like me. I devoured books, listened to lectures, and engaged in discussions that only deepened my sense of certainty. There was no God. There were no divine beings. The world was just as it seemed, a series of random events, meaningless, without any higher power pulling the strings. It was during those years that I began to build an online presence. My voice, my arguments, started to attract attention. I created videos, wrote articles, and debated anyone who dared to claim that faith had any merit. I built an audience around the idea that religion was a crutch, something that stopped people from thinking critically, from accepting the cold, hard truth that there was no higher purpose. The more I spoke out, the more followers I gained. They didn't just agree with me, they idolized me. I became a figurehead in the atheist community, a symbol of reason and logic. My message resonated with thousands of people who felt the same way I did, that faith was a lie, a distraction. I wasn't just an individual anymore. I was a voice, a movement. Success in the online world brought me a kind of fame I had never anticipated. People started recognizing me, not just in the streets, but on the internet. My debates with religious figures went viral. Each one of them was more intense than the last, and I reveled in it. I wasn't just participating in these debates. I was winning. Every argument I demolished was another notch on my belt. I had made a name for myself as someone who could go toe-to-toe with the most devout and still come out on top. I wasn't just dismantling their beliefs. I was showing people that they didn't need religion to live a meaningful life. They didn't need faith to be good people. All they needed was reason. But somewhere along the way, something changed. It wasn't about logic anymore. It became about domination. I wasn't just challenging beliefs, I was attacking them. Every conversation turned into a battleground, every comment a fight to prove my superiority. I wasn't content with simply being right. I needed to prove others wrong. I began to notice a shift in the way people saw me. I was no longer just an influencer or a philosopher to them. I had become a crusader, someone who was out to destroy what I saw as the biggest lie in human history. My followers fed into this, egging me on, telling me how much they admired my strength, my convictions. They didn't just agree with my message, they clung to it. They lived by it. And I became their leader. But in the midst of this success, something started to feel off. I was no longer just an intellectual figure. I had become a spokesperson for a movement, an ideology that required loyalty, devotion, and passion. The community I had helped build was no longer just a place for debate and reason. It had become a place of extreme certainty, where there was no room for doubt, no room for questioning. If you weren't with us, you were against us. There was no middle ground. The cost of this shift became evident in my personal life. My family, who had always been devout, began to drift further away. They couldn't understand what I was doing. They couldn't grasp why I had turned my back on everything they had taught me. My parents, once my biggest supporters, now saw me as a lost cause, someone they couldn't save. The phone calls stopped. The visits grew fewer, and the emptiness that had once been a distant whisper started to grow louder. But I didn't care. I was right. I was winning. At least that's what I told myself. Every day I preached to my followers. I told them that belief in anything beyond ourselves was foolish, a waste of time. I showed them how to fight for truth, for reason, how to stand against the weakness of faith. But the more I pushed forward, the more I realized that the louder I got, the emptier I felt. The first sign of something shifting came in the form of a phone call. It was the middle of a Thursday, and I was wrapped up in preparing content for the next debate. It was an ordinary day, one of those days when the usual hustle and online activity masked the deeper things I had started to ignore. But the call changed everything. My father had passed away. He had been ill for years, his health deteriorating in ways that I hadn't kept track of. I had distanced myself from him long ago, long before his sickness had taken a turn for the worse. Our relationship had been tense, filled with the kind of silence that only grows over time. My departure from the faith he held so dearly had created an unspoken chasm between us, one that neither of us had ever tried to bridge. I was barely affected at first. After all, He had been a figure I had left behind in my pursuit of a life grounded in reason and logic. So I didn't feel the sharp sting of loss in the way others might have expected. I was, however, struck by something else. The weight of the unresolved conflict between us. In the years leading up to his death, I had never taken the time to understand him. I never tried to see his faith from his perspective, nor had I ever allowed myself to hear his side of the story. But the phone call brought something else into focus, a sense of regret, a feeling that I had wasted my final moments with him, too absorbed in my own beliefs to even care about his. That's when I broke. It didn't happen all at once, but over the course of a few days. It started with an unsettling emptiness, an inability to focus on anything that mattered. My work, my followers, my arguments, all of it seemed so far removed from what was happening inside me. The very things I had built my identity around no longer held the same weight. Instead of clarity, I found myself drowning in confusion. I started to feel like I was losing control. The pressure from the debates, the demands from my followers, the constant need to prove myself, all of it suddenly felt irrelevant. In my attempt to keep everything together, to stay firm in my stance, I had built a wall around myself. But it wasn't solid. It was fragile. And one night, while sitting in front of my computer trying to write another post, the floodgates opened. The tears came, and they didn't stop. It wasn't just the loss of my father. It was the realization that in my quest to tear down everything he believed, I had never really considered the cost of doing so. The cost to him. The cost to me. A few days later, as I was sorting through his things, I found something. It was an old, weathered journal that had been tucked away in a drawer, one I had never seen before. I opened it, and the first entry was dated years before I had left for college. It was a prayer. Not just any prayer, but a prayer for me. He had written about his hopes, his dreams for me, the love he felt even though I had rejected everything he stood for. And in the midst of those words, I found something I couldn't ignore. A deep, aching desire for me to find peace. True peace. A peace rooted in faith. I had laughed at him. I had mocked his prayers. But now, reading them through a different lens, I saw his vulnerability, his love, and his heartache. He had never stopped praying for me, even when I had walked away. And in that moment I realized something that shattered everything I thought I knew. I had all these followers, but I'd never felt more alone. They admired me, yes. They hung on every word, every argument, but they didn't know me. They didn't know the parts of me that were unraveling. They didn't know the doubts, the questions, the fear that had been eating away at me for so long. My father had prayed for me all those years, and yet I had built my life on rejecting the very things he held dear. His death, his absence, made it impossible for me to avoid that reality any longer. I was left with nothing but the words in the journal and the haunting truth that I had never truly allowed myself to understand him. I had never allowed myself to understand love in the way he did. The funeral came quickly, and my first instinct was to avoid it. I didn't want to face the people who had known him in the ways I hadn't. I didn't want to be reminded of all the years I had spent fighting against him, against his faith. But something inside me, something I couldn't ignore, told me I needed to go. So I did. Reluctantly, I attended his funeral. The moment I stepped into the church, I felt a tension in my chest. The atmosphere was foreign to me. The rituals, the prayers, the hymns, they all seemed like the same things I had rejected so fiercely. But as the service went on, something began to stir within me. I watched the mourners, their faces filled with sorrow, yet there was a kind of peace in their eyes, a peace I couldn't quite understand. They weren't lost in anger or bitterness. They were grieving, yes, but they were also holding on to something. something that transcended the loss of my father. After the service, I was introduced to members of my father's church community. People I had never met, people who had known him in ways I hadn't. They spoke of him with reverence, not because of his title or position, but because of his faith. It was the same faith I had dismissed for so long. Yet the more I listened to them speak, the more I found myself drawn in. Their words about him were filled with love, not just for him, but for me too. They told me how much my father had prayed for me, how much he had hoped for my return. And in that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. My father's faith wasn't just about religion. It was about love. It was about devotion, not to a set of beliefs, but to people, to me. But it was when I found the letters that had been hidden away in his belongings that everything truly began to shift. They weren't just any letters. They were letters my father had written to me over the years, letters I had never received. In each one, he expressed his love for me, his hope for my happiness, and his unwavering belief that I would one day come to understand what he had always known. I sat in the quiet room where I had found the letters, reading each one over and over again. And as I read, I felt something break inside me. A door that I had kept shut for years had finally opened, and for the first time, I allowed myself to grieve. Not just for the father I had lost, but for the relationship we had never had. The weight of the letters, the weight of my father's faith and love, was more than I could bear. It didn't make sense. His faith, which I had once mocked, now felt like the one thing that could make sense of my own confusion. The people who mourned him, they didn't mourn as those who had no hope. Their joy made no logical sense. They had lost someone, yes, but they celebrated. They celebrated his life, his faith, and his love. The days following my father's funeral were a blur. I had returned home to the place I had left years ago, sitting in the same room that had once been my childhood sanctuary. The room was dim, with the faint smell of dust in the air and the remnants of my past lingering in the corners. But this time, the weight of the house felt different. It was as though the walls were pressing in on me, reminding me of the absence, not just of my father, but of the certainty I had once clung to. It had been easy to dismiss the idea of faith, to make arguments about logic and reason when I was surrounded by an audience that believed in the same things I did. But now, alone in the quiet of my father's house, those arguments felt hollow. The things I had once relied on to anchor me felt flimsy, like a house built on sand. I couldn't explain it, but something had shifted within me. The confident certainty that I had worn as a shield was crumbling. I felt lost, unsettled, and the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. I had spent so many years constructing an identity built on rejecting everything my father had believed. I had built an audience, a following that hung on every word I said. But now, standing in the midst of his things, his Bible, his journals, the letters he had written to me, everything that had once seemed so clear now felt complicated. I couldn't ignore the gnawing questions that had started to surface, questions I had spent years suppressing. Late at night, when the world outside was still, I found myself drawn to the bookshelf in my father's study. There it was, the Bible. The same one he had carried with him for years, the same one he had read from every day, the one that had been a constant presence in his life. I picked it up, hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The words on the pages seemed foreign, distant, like a language I had forgotten. But as I turned the pages, something inside me stirred. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stop reading. At first I read with skepticism, trying to rationalize everything. The story seemed too far-fetched, the teachings too simplistic. Yet, as I continued, I felt a strange pull. I had never been one to believe in anything supernatural, anything outside of the material world. But now, as I read my father's Bible, I couldn't ignore the way the words seemed to reach out to me, almost as if they were speaking directly to the turmoil inside me. The doubts I had lived with for so long, about my father, about my own identity, about the world itself, began to rise to the surface. It was uncomfortable, like a battle between my mind and my heart. My head screamed that this was all nonsense, that faith was a crutch for those who couldn't face reality. But my heart, in the quiet moments, whispered something different. It was as though a part of me wanted to believe, wanted to know if there was something more to this life than the rigid framework of logic I had built around myself. One night, after reading a passage about forgiveness, I found myself alone in the room, the Bible still open in my hands. My fingers trembled slightly as I closed it and stared at the floor, the weight of what I had just read settling in my chest. Without thinking, I whispered a prayer. It wasn't a formal prayer, not the kind my father would have said, but something raw and honest. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I need something. I can't keep going like this. I expected nothing, but when the words left my lips, it felt like the room had shifted. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation, but something more subtle. A sense of peace, however fleeting, washed over me. I didn't know how to explain it, but I couldn't deny that in that moment I felt heard. My head was fighting my heart, and my heart was winning. The realization stung, but it was undeniable. I was at war with myself. Every fiber of my being resisted the idea of belief, but something in me was slowly surrendering. My atheist identity had been my armor for so long, but now, in the quiet darkness of my father's study, I was beginning to see cracks in the armor. The walls I had built to keep my emotions at bay were starting to crumble, and I was terrified. It wasn't until a week later that everything came to a head. I had been avoiding the study, the Bible, and even the thoughts that had been creeping into my mind. I tried to fill the void with work, with distractions, with anything that could silence the questions that refused to let go of me. But I couldn't outrun them. They followed me relentlessly, until I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, I found myself once again sitting in the study, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The house was quiet, eerily so. I hadn't intended to return to the Bible, but as I sat there, I felt an undeniable pull to it. I opened the pages once again, reading the words my father had read countless times, and for the first time, I felt something that terrified me, an overwhelming sense of presence. It wasn't just the stillness of the room, it was something more, something that reached beyond the physical space I occupied. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, heavy with an energy I couldn't explain. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It grew stronger, until I felt like I wasn't alone in the room. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. Yet the presence was undeniable. My heart raced as I stood frozen in place, a mix of fear and awe flooding my senses. It was as if the room had come alive, the walls closing in, the air thick with something I couldn't name. It was a sensation I couldn't ignore, a sensation that pulled me deeper into something I didn't understand. Then, almost instinctively, I dropped to my knees. I had never prayed like this before. I had never needed to. But in that moment the words came, unbidden and raw. God, if you're really there, I don't know if I believe in you, but I can't keep fighting anymore. Please, show me the truth. In that moment, something shifted. The overwhelming sense of presence seemed to soften, and the fear that had gripped me slowly dissipated. It wasn't an explosion of light or a voice from the heavens, but something real, something undeniable, settled in my heart. In the silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace I had expected, or the kind I had read about in philosophical books. It wasn't logical. It wasn't something I could explain with words. But it was there, a quiet assurance that I had just experienced something that shattered every argument, every belief I had held onto so tightly. All my clever arguments, all my carefully constructed defenses, crumbled in the face of something real. The logic I had relied on seemed small now, insignificant compared to what I had just felt. For the first time, I understood. And in that moment, I was left with a choice: to continue on the path I had walked for so long, or to step into something new, something unknown. The days that followed that night in my father's study felt like an overwhelming flood of change, each moment sweeping me farther from the person I had once been. I had always prided myself on being a rational man, on relying on my own reasoning and rejecting anything that couldn't be explained logically. Yet here I was, standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully comprehend, something that defied the very foundation of my beliefs. I had never planned for this. I had never imagined that the path I had walked, so carefully constructed around arguments and facts, would come to an abrupt halt. Yet here I stood, faced with an undeniable truth. I had to change. I couldn't keep pretending that the experiences I had felt, those moments of peace, those quiet whispers of something greater, hadn't happened. They had, and they were too real to ignore. The first step in that change was something I had feared for so long: telling my followers the truth. I had spent years building an online presence, fostering a community of people who believed in what I said. They had followed me because I had given them answers, because I had provided a voice for their doubts and frustrations. But now, I was about to tear it all down. I knew that revealing my shift would cost me everything: my platform, my influence, maybe even the respect of those who had once admired me. But I had no choice. I took a deep breath, staring at the screen of my computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't going to be easy. There was no way to sugarcoat it. I couldn't explain the feelings I had experienced, the transformation I had gone through, without sounding like a fraud. I had spent so many years mocking belief, ridiculing faith, and now I was about to tell the world that I had found something I never thought I would, a faith I couldn't deny. I typed the message slowly, unsure of how to even begin. To my followers, I owe you the truth. For years, I have stood before you, speaking as someone who rejected faith. I built my platform on challenging beliefs I didn't understand, but something has changed. I can no longer ignore what I've experienced, what I've felt. I don't have all the answers, but I have to be honest with you. I've found peace in something I never expected. I can't pretend anymore. I'm not the same person I was when I started this journey. I hesitated before hitting send. What would they think? Would they reject me? Would they accuse me of being weak, of falling for something I had once called a crutch? But as I hit the send button, a strange weight lifted from my chest. I had told the truth, and that was enough. The responses came in quickly, some angry, some confused, but many supportive. There were those who thanked me for my honesty, for sharing my journey with them. But there were others who unfollowed, who turned their backs on me, unable to reconcile the person I had been with the person I had become. It was painful, but it was also liberating. The loss of my platform, the loss of my following, stung. It was as though the world I had built for myself, my identity, my purpose, had vanished in an instant. But in the space left behind, I found something unexpected: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace I had imagined, the kind I had once sought in arguments and logic. It was deeper, quieter, more elusive. It was the kind of peace that didn't come from being right, but from knowing I had found something true. The next change came when I reached out to my family. I hadn't spoken to them in years, not since I had rejected everything they had believed in. My father had prayed for me, but I had dismissed him as delusional, trapped in a world of superstition. And now he was gone. But his absence, his love, and the quiet faith he had lived with were still present in my life. It was time to bridge the gap I had created. The first phone call was awkward. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of all the years of silence. But I knew I had to take the first step. I told my mother about the changes I had gone through, about the new faith I had found. I expected her to be upset, to tell me I was just confused, that I would come to my senses eventually. But instead she listened. She didn't judge. And when I finished speaking, she simply said, "I've been praying for this day." It wasn't easy. Rebuilding those relationships took time, and there were moments when I doubted whether it was even possible. But slowly, one conversation at a time, I began to rebuild. I began to heal the wounds I had inflicted on my family. They had never given up on me, even when I had turned my back on them. Through the mess of it all, I found a new purpose. It wasn't about being right anymore. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about seeking the truth, wherever it led. It was about helping others who were struggling, who were wrestling with the same doubts and questions I had once faced. I couldn't keep all of this to myself. I had to share it. I had to build something new, not an audience to follow me, but a community to walk alongside me. I lost my platform, I would say, but I found my peace. And in that peace, I began to find the courage to help others. In the months that followed, I found myself becoming something I had never expected, a bridge builder. I started speaking to those who were struggling with faith, people who were in the same place I had been. They had questions, doubts, pain, and a desire for answers. I knew exactly what they were feeling, and I knew how it felt to have no one to turn to. I had spent years building walls of logic, walls of skepticism, walls that kept people out. But now, I saw the value in building bridges. I didn't have all the answers, but I had my story. And my story could be a bridge to help others cross the divide between doubt and faith. I could walk alongside them, not with answers, but with understanding. Helping others wasn't about giving them the answers I had found, but about giving them the space to explore their own. I'd come to realize that faith wasn't something to be argued into someone's life. It had to be experienced. It had to be felt. It was about providing a safe place for others to wrestle with their doubts, to ask questions without judgment, and to take the time they needed to find their own truth. I also found myself becoming a source of healing for those who had been hurt by religion. I met people who had suffered under the weight of guilt and shame, people who had been abused by those in positions of power within the church, people who had been told they were unworthy or broken. The journey had been long, and the transformation was far from over. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same person I had been, and I was finally at peace with that. I had spent so much time looking for the right words, for the perfect logical argument to convince others of my viewpoint. But in the end, the greatest argument for God, the one that completely dismantled all my carefully constructed beliefs, wasn't an argument at all. It was an encounter. And that encounter had come to me in a way I could never have predicted. It had shaken me to my core, not with logical reasoning, but with an undeniable sense of something real, something beyond myself. There were no clever words or convincing arguments, just a quiet, powerful presence that could not be ignored. And that was the moment everything changed. I'd come to realize that doubt wasn't something to fear. It wasn't something that disqualified me from faith. It wasn't a weakness or something to suppress. Doubt had been my companion on this journey, challenging me, pushing me to ask hard questions, to confront the very foundation of everything I thought I knew. But in the midst of that doubt, I had found truth. Not the kind of truth that could be argued or defended, but the kind of truth that had to be lived, the kind that could only be experienced. In embracing doubt, I discovered a faith that was stronger than any argument I had ever made. The doubts I had once clung to had led me to a place where I could no longer deny what I had felt, what I had experienced. And that, more than anything, had been the most important lesson of all. Faith wasn't about certainty. It was about trust. It was about surrendering to something bigger than yourself, something that didn't require perfect understanding, but simply the willingness to follow. Authenticity, too, had become a guiding principle. As I stand here today, looking back on the journey that has brought me to this point, I feel a deep sense of gratitude, not for the certainty I once thought I needed, but for the doubt that led me here, for the questions that never stopped coming, for the struggles that never fully went away, but ultimately brought me closer to the truth I had been seeking all along. If you're listening to this, and you find yourself in the same place I was, wrestling with doubt, questioning everything you thought you knew, I want you to know that you're not alone. Your doubts don't disqualify you from faith. They might be the beginning of your journey. Please, if this resonates with you, I encourage you to share your own story in the comments. Tell us about your doubts, your journey, and where you are now. You never know. Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs to keep going. Let's create a space where we can learn from each other, heal together, and walk this path with open hearts and minds. So, to those of you who are still searching, still wrestling with doubt, take heart. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take the next step. Ask the next question. You might be closer than you think. Thank you for watching Graceful Narratives, a community of people who seek inspiration, faith, and a deeper connection to their spirituality. By subscribing, you become part of a journey that uplifts, encourages, and brings hope. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could touch your heart or change your perspective. Join us. We'd love to have you as part of this growing family of faith.